But I just want to wish everyone good morning. Welcome to the State of the County, our 6th annual meeting. I think this is an important event just to get a sense of where we are, particularly in light of the past year and a half. So really pleased to be able to do this event and happy that you could join us. Originally, when we were looking at planning this event, it was back in probably early in the year, January, not knowing if we could do this in person. As it turns out, we probably could, but it is what it is. We're here going forward. We will be doing in-person events and be looking forward to being able to talk to people in person. Today's event will feature 3 speakers who will present information from different perspectives around our economy, the workforce, and how our taxes are being spent. The pandemic certainly has brought many challenges, but it has also brought some opportunities, and I know that our speakers will address some of those as well. In terms of just basic housekeeping items, I think most people have been on these Zoom meetings and that, but if you could just keep your speakers muted during the presentation while the speakers are speaking, and then what we'll do is at the end of the 3 presenters' remarks, we'll open that up for questions. And so, we have 3 speakers today. Our first speaker, I'm pleased to announce here, is Mark Luberda. He's Walworth County Administrator. About midway through, not quite midway through his 2nd year, but we're really happy to have Mark in that role and also with us today. And so, I'd like to just, why don't we get started? We have a lot to talk about, but I think everyone's going to enjoy it. And again, thank you for being here. So with that, Mark, we'll let you start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Good morning, everyone. I am Mark Luberda. I'm the Walworth County Administrator, and I'm pleased to present an overview of the state of Walworth County today. I'll quickly review a variety of topics about the county and its finances, some looking backwards, some looking forward, most budget related. And together, I hope it presents a static picture, a snapshot of where we are, but also a sort of a dynamic view of what's on the horizon. When you're looking at local governments, probably the most significant perspective of the state of the county is the county's overall fiscal health. The 2020 audit, which is wrapping up, provides probably the simplest metric of the fiscal health, which is what are our unassigned reserves. The appropriate minimum unassigned general fund balance for governments is generally in the area of 15 to 20%. You generally don't want to have much more than 30%. And as of December 31st of 2020, the unassigned fund balance for Walworth County was around 25.9 million, which is just about 29%. So we're right in the target range that we want at the upper end of it, which is good. Of that 2020 provided excess available funds in the neighborhood of about 8.4 million. So with where we are in the audit process, we have not sort of created a plan for those excess returns from the close of 2020 specifically, but these reserves have historically been used to fund ongoing capital projects. We've also used some to increase our building and equipment reserves. And then we also have historically used them to eliminate and now continuing to avoid further debt. So those 2 steps sort of creates a 1-2 punch toward continuing our long-term financial stability. Such planned use of the reserves can create leverage to support financial stability. For example, observing how sales tax revenues were expected to be impacted by the pandemic during 2020, we used 2.2 million of the previous year to establish a new revenue stabilization fund balance that's dedicated to providing stability to the county's 3 largest revenues, the 3 that aren't property taxes or state shared revenues. Those 3 are the 0.5% county sales tax, interest and penalties on delinquent taxes, and realized investment income. Those play a big role in our annual budget, and if one of them were to take an unexpected hit that could be problematic. So we've created this dedicated revenue stabilization fund that ensures unexpected dramatic impacts against these revenue sources can be counterbalanced and sort of make sure we don't have any immediate negative impacts on operations from any impact on those revenues. So table 1 shown on your screen, it shows that beyond this sort of general fund unassigned, we have other fund balances that we hold in place as reserves for our operations. And these are balances as of the end of last year. Together, this dedicates approximately another $10 million to help ensure that the fiscal and operational categories that are in the column labeled fund name, that they have the security and stability before even potentially drawing on the general fund reserves. So again, a sort of belt and suspenders strategy to making sure that we have the reserves for ongoing operations and to avoid those swings in various revenue sources. Now, these numbers may seem large when I talk about having 25 million in the general fund reserves and another 10 million in specific fund reserves. But to put them in perspective, the county's total 2021 tax levy is just over $60 million, and our budgeted expenditures for regular operations is about 148 million a year, with an additional 11 to 12 million dollars in capital expenditures. So the reserves are clearly substantial, but they are at an appropriate level given the size of the organization from a fiscal perspective. One little sidebar that I think is worth noting out of all those numbers, the most interesting thing is probably that I mentioned our annual levy being about $60 million in property taxes, and that's almost identical to where it was just 11 years ago. So the county's been continuing to operate on the same level of property tax revenues. Sales tax revenues also provide an interesting perspective on county finances. So if you could flip to table 2, thank you. Many counties and the Wisconsin Counties Association as a whole anticipated 2020 would see a reduction in local property tax receipts. Many counties were very concerned with the numbers that we're receiving, but in Walworth County, that did not occur. In total, sales tax revenues increased nearly 4% last year. I think they would have been higher had the pandemic not occurred, but from a budgetary perspective, we met what we needed to. The first 3 months of 2021, we've seen an increase of just over 20% from the first 3 months of last year. And so we're currently up 462,000 from the first 3 months of 2020. So I think the stimulus spending of families, spending things on their house, the houses that everyone were trapped in, and I believe our location, sharing the border with Illinois, were all part of a strong sales tax year. And this bodes well for the 2021 budget and the 2022 budget. One of the larger threats that many communities face financially is the outstanding liability from other post-employment benefits, also called OPEBs. In Walworth County's case, it's health insurance benefits due to retirees. Joel, if you could move to table 3. The county has addressed this issue in the past, so this benefit is not continuing to increase and has in fact dropped by over half since 2009. I apologize, the only slide I had available didn't have the 2020 numbers on it, but this does give you a good historical perspective. The remaining actuarially established liability is right about $9.9 million. At the same time, the trust fund balance currently reflects assets of over 30 million at the end of 2020. So these kinds of costs can be a long-term threat to many communities. You probably hear about it in the news, pension risks and things like that. But for Walworth County, we don't have to contribute any new funds on an ongoing basis, and there's very little to no risk that the county will have any issues from these funds. So I always like to mention that. A couple of other potential threats to the budget that are worth briefly mentioning. In the years running up to 2020, the Lakeland Healthcare Center was seeing unsustainable growth in the levy reliance. As I was being hired, the facility was being right-sized to a 90-bed facility, and at the same time, the pandemic hit, which really impacted operational costs. We brought on a new director, tried to downsize and anticipate exactly how the budget would work. It became difficult to judge exactly how well the 90-bed facility budget reflected realistic needs. Although the pandemic continues to impact the facility, we believe the ongoing operational budget is accurately reflecting needs and that the prior unsustainable demand has been stabilized. So I think that risk has been eliminated. The wall-to-wall shared ride transit program was also identified as a growing levy draw going into 2020. If we could move to table 4, this just shows the ridership of that service over each year. Hundreds of thousands of dollars was added to support the program in early 2020, just as I was coming on board. And the contract with the state was expanded significantly to address this growing demand. And then the pandemic hit. And you can see in what's showing up as a green line there, at the top, the ridership plummeted by about 2/3 back to 2017 levels, from 4,500 trips per month to around 1,500 trips. Ridership has been steadily climbing and is now tracking 2018 levels. It almost looks like we're back on the same path again, but it's still remaining lagging behind those pre-pandemic levels and peaks. Nonetheless, I think this area represents one of the county's future pressure points and one of the most interesting decisions it will likely have to address. Because transportation service is essential to many people, providing access to work and school, doctors, and groceries. I recently performed a detailed review of the program and program costs. If we could move to table 5. Our service is most like that of Ozaukee and Washington counties in the state. I looked at every shared ride program, and these are the two that really sort of mirror what we're doing. They have slightly higher population levels, but from an overall perspective, theirs is very similar. Ours is just sort of new and growing. From a per capita comparison suggests that we could see anywhere from a 60 to 150% increase from our previous peak service levels, where we were already stretching to find new levy to support the program. So if we promote the service and let the service grow unfettered to keep pace with demand, we will be providing a valuable service to the riders and to the businesses those riders are going to or working at. And these services do tend to be generally funded about 50% by federal pass-through dollars from the state. Nonetheless, our levy-supported costs could still increase by $600,000 or more in the near future. So that's going to create some tough decisions that will need to be made on controlling. Either do we try and meet this level of service, or do we try and control that demand through rate increases, through limiting service hours, limiting vehicle availability, or do we just try to continue to enhance the services, which means finding more money to meet the growing demand? So I think that this is one of the areas that will be sort of really important to our future and have some interesting impacts on the economy as we try to find ways to help workers be able to make it to their jobs. Another new interesting program development that I think is worth mentioning and could have future budgetary impacts is the Embedded Crisis Liaison Program. You may have heard about this program because it did receive some coverage in the press. This program started as a pilot program this year. It places 2 crisis intervention specialists directly into 2 local police departments. The individuals serve during peak hours, but have the ability to be on call 24/7. And in summary, the program aids the police departments by allowing officers to return to policing duties elsewhere in the community, as the crisis intervention specialists can remain and take over addressing the issues once the scene has been stabilized. Not every police department response requires a police department service. Sometimes these intervention specialists can address issues more appropriately, bringing resources from the department. It also provides greater access to the services to ensure that immediate community-based accessibility and follow-up occurs with these individuals who may benefit from services of the Health and Human Services departments. So we created 2 positions for 2021. They've been in place. They've been very well received. One is in Delavan, one is in Whitewater. But during the pandemic, there's been a heightened need for mental health services. The sheriff will tell you domestic abuse is up, and there's other call increases that indicate a heightened need for mental health services. So one of the items that the ARPA funds, which I'll talk about more in a minute, may be able to help support is expanding this program to other local departments. And we can use these funds through 2024, so we can really get a sense of the benefit of the program and expand it. So all of that could be a tremendous boon for local law enforcement and for the citizens who get prompt intervention. However, it could be a real pressure on the operating budget if the program then has to end in 2025 when the ARPA funds are no longer available, or the county will have to find somewhere in their neighborhood of $500,000 to continue the program countywide. So again, we'd be looking at that question of services versus revenues. If I hadn't started out by pointing out our strong financial position, one would likely anticipate that the pandemic could easily have had a substantial negative effect on counties' finances. And that's been the case in many communities. Many counties have had to lay some people off, and that's simply not the case for Walworth County, given the grant support that we received from the state and federal government. In 2020, we spent approximately $4.5 million in pandemic-related grant funds from state and federal sources. Given the population that we have, we probably had slightly higher resources than some other counties because we have both the nursing home and the special needs school. So those were eligible for a variety of additional grant support. So we had approximately 4.5 million. So it goes without saying that the pandemic generated an unprecedented level of support from state and federal government. Nonetheless, we could not be sure that every expenditure would fall neatly into one of those buckets. Therefore, the county committed early on about $312,000 from the general fund. We did that early in 2020 just to make sure we had something to get started. And all of this, however, was ultimately carried forward into 2021 because the funding we received really covered what we needed, or created an offset to what we needed if it wasn't a direct payment. And the Finance Committee in June, we plan actually to recommend moving these reserves forward and transfer them to our new Recovery Grants Fund to fund anything that would be ineligible under ARPA or any of the other pandemic grants. Importantly, early in 2021, the county set aside another 1.5 million of anticipated Health and Human Services Department 2020 year-end unexpended funds to create a 2021 pandemic reserve. We did this well before the feds developed or were even talking about the American Rescue Plan Act. I told the county board they should anticipate that there would be funding coming, but we were in the transition between administrations in Washington, and the county really couldn't wait for them to make up their mind. So we set aside 1.5 million at the time because we couldn't be sure what the feds were doing. Well, with ARPA, the funds we set aside remain available, and they'll probably expire and return to the general fund at the close of 22. because the American Rescue Funds will address everything we need. And so with that, I'll sort of transition and talk a little bit about those, sort of looking forward. I don't think you could talk about the state of the county without mentioning the American Rescue Plan Act funding that the county will receive. You'll hear it called by two names. The section within the act that addresses local government funding is called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. That's its official title. Walworth County is receiving slightly over $20.1 million, while all the towns and villages and cities in Walworth County will receive over an additional $10.2 million. So that's over $30 million of direct federal aid coming into the county, which is clearly unprecedented. If you could move to table 6, please. I'm not going to read this all to you, I promise, but here's the wording directly from the Act of Congress as what the American Rescue Plan actually funds. That's it, 20 to $30 million to do those 4 things. And it took the US Treasury 2 months, and then they published their preliminary guidance, and it took them 150 something pages to explain those 4 statements right there. And I think sort of humorously, they tend to break those 4 into 5 categories. So just really quickly, it's support of public health expenditures, addressing negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. So that could include addressing economic harms to workers, households, small businesses, impacted industries. So a pretty broad category there. Replace lost public sector revenue using this funding to provide government services. That's a pretty significant category because they've created a broad category and an easy calculation that lets you say, as a local government, we would have lost this amount, so we can bring it into our coffers, and then the strings on them become much looser. They're still limited, there's still restrictions, but you have a much broader category of what you can use it for if it's really providing sort of direct government services. So that will be an interesting category that we will likely take advantage of. We can use it to provide premium pay for essential workers. And interestingly, they added invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Broadband is probably the trickiest one of those to get your arms around. But I think the water and sewer were added into this category very much like a sort of old FDR, get everybody working, get projects happening, get money flowing to the economy. So I think that's why they added that. And that's definitely one of the categories that we've got some ideas we'll be presenting to the county board. With this group in particular, I think I'll talk a little bit more when they talk about the negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency, because they've identified that further. That says we can do things where we're delivering assistance to workers and family facing food, housing, or other financial security, and we can support small businesses, helping them to address the financial challenges they've had to it. So they specifically call out speeding the recovery of the tourism, travel, and hospitality sectors, which I think everyone here knows is a big part of the Walworth County economy. We can rebuild the public sector capacity. We won't have to do much there because, like I said earlier, we haven't really had those negative impacts on our operations. And then we can address negative economic impacts caused by public health emergency. And that's where we can get to households, small businesses, impacted industries. So I did some digging, working with the State Department administration, and Walworth County received 1,006 were all in program grants from the states. Those were the CARES Act funds that the state gave. Phase 1 gave up to $2,500 in grants. Phase 2 gave $5,000, and there was a smaller Phase 3 that gave up to $20,000. We had 835 businesses that got at least one of those grants, so unique businesses, a fairly substantial number. 277 got just the Phase 1, 360 got just the Phase 2, 169 got both. There were only about 30 that got the Phase 3, but in total, That amounted to about $4.3 million was awarded by the state just to Walworth County businesses. Now, those numbers aren't perfect because the data comes by community, and we have some boundary crossing communities. So, but that gives you a good idea of the kind of contribution the state provided in the middle of the pandemic when they said, how can we give economic support to small businesses? So that's one of the things the county will need to think about. Should the county consider, as part of its distribution and use of the funds, piling on and maybe using some of those same programs and providing additional small grants to many businesses across the county? Will those payments make a difference if they again have to be capped at the $2,500 like phase one grants were? So that's one of the discussions we'll be having, is should the county engage in that same sort of direct economic grant to small businesses? So those will be the kinds of issues we'll be discussing. We'll be looking to engage more people and groups into this discussion. For example, I've already met with the United Way, the Housing Authority, Community Action, and a number of other individuals or groups. Issues addressing the broad continuum of housing and homelessness are valid considerations. The larger capital areas, such as broadband expansion, are widely open for considerations, but these are also complex issues that are not easily or quickly resolved as far as spending the money goes. Broadband itself could potentially, or at least theoretically, use all of the funding. So we do need to figure out, if we're going to address that, how to do it in an appropriate manner. Sort of professional guidance from some of our organizations, such as the Wisconsin Counties Association and the International City Managers Association. They want us to invest in long-term strategies such as sewer and water line repairs, and they're encouraging projects that provide years of benefit instead of just short-term expenditures that sort of go away. They want investments that will last for years. So I specifically asked Derek to provide a space for me on the WCETA agenda at this upcoming meeting to begin getting input on how business leaders think such funding could be applied. So as the county will begin discussing potential uses of preliminary strategies and funds for next week. So Derek, is that a good place to start? I have one other topic I can run through, but I think I'm running a little long, so.
I think it's good, Mark, and
Okay.
maybe if we have at the end a little bit of time, that'd be great. But I really appreciate your overview. You hit a lot of good points, and as an economic developer, it's always really, I think, eye-opening when I kind of share how our county is so fiscally, I guess fit would be a really good way to put it, and the way I describe it. And particularly, with our neighbors to the south there, they're experiencing just such, uncertainty with their taxes and things like that. So it's really great to hear that, we continue to be in such a sound position, and also that we have some opportunities here for some funding to do some really, like you said, kind of around transportation and potentially some infrastructure pieces and even housing. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Okay, well, so our next speaker is Rob Henken. And thank you again, Rob, for being here this year. Rob is the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and it's amazing how interesting you can make that topic. So really appreciate you being here, and look forward to your remarks. But with that, I'll let you get going.
Thank you very much, Derek. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Thanks to all of you out in our virtual audience for getting up bright and early and tuning in. So some of you may recall, I addressed this event, it must have been 2-3 years ago. And my topic, given that obviously the event is sponsored by an economic development organization, was to talk about sort of the state budget climate and how certain actions at the state level were impacting things like Walworth County's finances and municipal finances. And I was tempted to give an updated version of that set of remarks this morning, but I changed my mind. The main reason I changed my mind, and Mark illustrated this perfectly, is that this is such a moving target. There are so many uncertainties. A lot of the assumptions that local governments and state government were making as we were struggling in the early months of the pandemic have been turned on their head. And I guess I made the right decision because, as many of you may have noticed yesterday, the state received the phenomenal news that its own tax collections are at record levels. And so going forward, the state budget has dramatically improved. And again, things are changing by the day. So instead, as you can see on the screen, what I thought I would talk about this morning briefly is some of the observations and perceptions of the Wisconsin Policy Forum regarding local government service sharing and collaboration. We've done a lot of work in this area over the past 7 or 8 years. Our work in this area is increasing because we keep on getting approached by local governments who want our help, who want some impartial analysis regarding possibilities for service sharing and consolidation in many different areas. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, not the least of which is that I think the pandemic, the response to the pandemic that local governments like Walworth County had to put together immediately and strenuously, I think really taught some very important lessons about why it's so important to collaborate with one's governmental neighbors, and really tended to knock down some barriers in terms of some of the reluctance that some local governments have historically had in terms of looking for ways to share services. So I'm going to walk through some slides. First of all, just a reminder in terms of who I am and who the Wisconsin Policy Forum is. The Wisconsin Policy Forum was formed in 2018 when the Milwaukee-based Public Policy Forum, which had been around, believe it or not, since 1913, covering policy issues and government finance issues in Southeast Wisconsin, merged with the Madison-based Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, which had been around only since 1932. The merger created the Wisconsin Policy Forum. What is very important to know about us is that we continue the legacies of those two original organizations and the mission to conduct nonpartisan, fiercely nonpartisan policy research that is simply aimed at promoting more informed and more data-driven decision-making in the halls of local governments, across school districts across the state, and in state government. So that's what we're about. We are have somehow been able to maintain that credibility as a nonpartisan, impartial group for all of this time. And I think that's why local governments and school districts continuously turn to us for our research assistance. So I mentioned that shared services and consolidation research has been a major area of work for us and an increasing area of work for us over time. This slide is showing just 8 of our recent reports on service sharing and consolidation. Mark Luberda, when he was the administrator in the city of Franklin, had a chance to work with us on a couple of reports we did regarding fire services in the southern part of Milwaukee County. So we've done a lot of work in the areas of fire and EMS. We've done work on parks and recreation. We've done work on public health. We've done work on public safety dispatch, among others. And so most recently, however, really the emphasis for us has been on fire and EMS. So why is that? Well, there are a few reasons. Number one, for small fire departments throughout the state of Wisconsin that really rely heavily on part-time staff who are either pure volunteers or who are called in to respond to calls and are only paid on an hourly basis when they do so. That model is increasingly under duress due to a variety of societal factors, due to increasing call volumes. So for both fire and EMS, as folks are depending on that type of a workforce and experiencing this stress, there is greater need to consider other options. And so just since October, we have produced these 4 reports looking at EMS collaboration opportunities in Jefferson County, and also looking at both fire and EMS in Ozaukee and La Crosse counties. And just last week, we put out a report trying to help the Union Grove Yorkville Fire Department in Racine County navigate its way through some of these issues. So what I just want to do is share with you some observations that we have acquired that may be relevant to communities in Walworth County, hopefully will be, as they look to the future and try to figure out ways to address both their financial challenges, but more important, their service level challenges in this changing world that we live in. So first of all, in terms of when to pursue service sharing, this might be a surprise to you, but what we always emphasize when we come into a community is that the real promise is not in saving money. It's in the potential for individual governments to be able to join together and by working collaboratively to achieve levels of service quality and efficiency that they otherwise could not achieve by acting alone. In many cases, bigger is better. That there are service levels, particularly when we think about fire and EMS, that small communities could never be able to afford. But if they join with some of their neighbors, it may make certain service levels, the ability to have full-time fire and EMS staff who are at the station ready to respond, as an example, that might be doable on a collaborative basis. So really, again, that's about service level improvement. Is it less expensive to try to enhance service levels by acting collaboratively than it would be by acting alone? Often it is. But also, if you compare what you would need to spend to do so versus what you're spending today, sometimes there are not dollar savings. It's again about achieving those service level improvements in a more cost-efficient way. Despite the fact that we have seen several examples of where governmental service sharing and functional consolidation has worked very well, it's not always the best fit for various service areas and various local governments. So we've examined national research and believe that service sharing only may make sense under the right conditions. So example is when there's a retirement going on of a key leader or leaders. Again, using the fire and EMS example, if 2 or 3 different fire chiefs in a region are nearing retirement, that might be a good reason to consider service sharing and consolidation options. If a new requirement coming from state government or the federal government in terms of service quality, and this often happens on the public safety dispatch front, is requiring some major new investment. Again, banding together to try to make that investment may be a reason to look at service sharing. Also, when groups of governments are facing common problems like this part-time staffing challenge that I mentioned for fire and EMS, that's often another good reason. When there's evidence of clear duplication, again, or common challenges, that speaks for itself. And often there does need to be a previous history of cooperation among 2 or more governments. To try to bring 2 governments together to consolidate or share their fire services doesn't make sense if there, in many cases, if there hasn't been some type of previous history of cooperation. I want to give you now a few specific examples. I'm going to go through an example of perhaps the best example in our region in Southeast Wisconsin of where functional consolidation and service sharing has worked. And I also want to give you an example from a study we did where there just wasn't a good fit and it didn't work. So I'm going to start with Milwaukee County's North Shore Fire Department, which has been around since 1995. I imagine most of you are familiar with the North Shore communities in Milwaukee County, 7 individual villages, actually 6 villages plus the city of Glendale. Prior to 1995, each of these 7 municipalities had their own fire department, and there were firehouses in each of the communities. As a result of the merger of those 7 into the single North Shore Fire Department in 1995, they went down to 5. Now, we were called in 2015 on the 20-year anniversary to try to document what had been the experience for the North Shore. So a few of the key points we found, whereas if you looked at those 7 individual departments in 1994 pre-merger, there were 114 full-time equivalent employees. Looking at 2015, they were actually, for the North Shore Fire Department, they were down by about 7 staff people. So ostensibly, if service levels did not change, that's an efficiency and a potential improvement. You can see that the command staff was down, and that the number of firefighters and EMS responders combined was down. In terms of vehicles, here's where the difference is even more striking. Collectively, the 7 departments owned 31 pieces of apparatus pre-merger. The North Shore Fire Department only 16. When you think about the cost of replacing those vehicles over time, that's a sizable savings for these 7 communities. The trained paramedics increased from a total of 12 among the 7 departments in 1994 to 33 in 2015. Now, that would have happened on its own, presumably, but that would have been costly. And so the North Shore Fire Department really providing a higher level of service in terms of the number of paramedics available to respond to EMS calls, and not just EMS first responders.
This happened. 8th grade graduation.
Oh, somebody has their mic on, turn it off. So I mentioned that the number of stations went down from 7 to 5. Even though that happened, the response times were roughly equivalent 20 years later as they were prior to the merger. The quality of response was also far better. I won't get into those details. How are the response times roughly equivalent, despite the fact that there are 2 fewer stations? It's because of the ability to effectively and strategically deploy the resources among the existing 5 stations, plus the ability to staff each of those stations with full-time staff and not have to call in people from their home or from their workplace as volunteers to come in and respond to the fire or EMS call. And you don't just have to take it from me. The insurance industry that rates fire service, for those areas of the North Shore with hydrants, most of the departments were rated a 4 or a 5. The scale is 1 to 10. 1 is the best level of fire protection. 10 is the worst. So most of them were 4s and 5s. The North Shore Fire Department is one of the very best as a 2. So clearly the quality of the response and the response capability improved dramatically. So, and also finally, the fact that there were unified training protocols and communications throughout the North Shore, because they were being served by 1 department, was found to really make a difference on the ground. Again, I'm not doing justice to the full analysis, but arguably a far better level of service using far fewer resources. Now, on the financial side, and again, I said at the beginning that saving money is not the most important thing to consider here, but really what happened in Milwaukee County's North Shore is pretty phenomenal. So we took a look at the combined budgets of each of the departments in 1993 pre-merger. So those 7 municipalities were spending a combined total of $7.7 million at that time. If we simply use the consumer price index and adjusted that number to 2014, which was the latest year for which we had actual spending data, they would have all been spending collectively $12.7 million. Now that's very conservative. Oftentimes for services like fire and EMS, expenditure needs grow faster than CPI, but just being very conservative, the 7 communities, if everything had stayed the same and just had been adjusted by CPI, would have been spending $12.7 million. If we went 1 step further and said, what would have happened if these 7 communities had tried to also ramp up their service levels so that essentially each of them were providing the same level of service as the most robust department in the region, which was Glendale, was providing in 93. Collectively, then they would have been spending $14.4 million. What were they actually spending in 2014 collectively? $11.6 million. So essentially a savings of about $2.7 million annually for these 7 communities to have a much higher quality of fire and rescue service. I'm not going to show you the slide with the capital numbers, but the capital numbers also several $1 million of savings over those 20 years from the fact that the fleet had been reduced and the need to not have to replace all of those vehicles. So why did the North Shore Fire Department merger happen and why was it successful? Well, first of all, there were several retiring chiefs in that region. They talked about this for 10 years before it happened. But by the time it happened, they had several chiefs who were looking to retire. There wasn't a single one of the existing chiefs from the 7 departments who was angling to be the chief of the new combined fire department. And so that made a difference. They didn't have that potential obstacle to overcome. They had elected officials in Milwaukee County's North Shore who were already cooperating on a range of different topics and who were committed to cooperation. But one of the foremost factors here was a mutual threat. The city of Milwaukee was providing a very high level of mutual aid to all of these smaller communities, to the extent that city of Milwaukee leaders were saying, look, we're not going to be able to continue to give you this type of assistance because you have such small part-time fire departments. For the most part, 5 of the 7 did. We're going to have to start charging you for that. So that was number one. Number two, there were 2 very high profile major structure fires in the North Shore in the preceding years that all of the chiefs agreed the response could have been and should have been better. So those were key factors. And finally, not just the city of Milwaukee, but the larger departments in Brown Deer and Glendale were also growing tired of having to pick up the slack for the smaller communities like River Hills and Bayside and Fox Point, which were trying to make do either with part-time departments or with combined public safety officers who did both fire and police. So those were some of the important factors. And there was sort of a mutual recognition that in this case, they would be able to achieve a level of fire protection and EMS service with a bigger department than any of them could provide on their own. So that's an example of success. Very briefly, I want to give you an example where things didn't pan out. We were called in by the communities of Oak Creek and South Milwaukee to explore a consolidated public health department. Now, public health is consolidated at the county level in Walworth County and in all counties with the exception of Milwaukee County and to a limited extent Racine and Dane counties. So there are 11 different municipal public health departments in Milwaukee County. The North Shore actually recently combined all of its health departments as well as its fire department. So we were called in to look at a potential consolidated health department. And I'm showing you this demographic information because oftentimes the partners may not be perfect. In this case, we had 2 communities looking to share a service that in many respects were different. Oak Creek, much larger in terms of square miles and population. Oak Creek, a growing community, South Milwaukee not. Oak Creek, an older community, and Oak Creek, a wealthier community. And so this is not a given. There are plenty of examples of communities that have been able to share who are not demographically similar, but in this case, you just looked on paper and saw that there may be some challenges to overcome here. Despite these differences, however, in demographics, there were lots of similarities in terms of the level of public health services that were being provided. So when we looked at budgeted expenditures and at staffing, despite the difference in the population size, Oak Creek and South Milwaukee, very similar in terms of the size and capacity of the public health department. So that led us to believe that there may be some promise here. Indeed, we did a lot of work with the 2 public health officers. We created a hypothetical org chart for a department, and we found several potential benefits for merging these 2 departments. Unfortunately, one of the things we didn't find was dollar savings. And that was because the consolidated department we modeled not only looked at how to combine the 2, but also looked at how to achieve a much higher level of public health service while doing so. So it was really the expansion of service that created the extra cost and not the act of consolidating. And indeed, given that we had added some service capacity, the fact that there was still a minor cost savings for the 2 communities was actually something that was significant. But bottom line question for elected officials, well, if there are no dollar savings here versus what we're spending today, why would we consolidate? Well, first of all, you'd have greater nursing and environmental health staff capacity with no increase in cost. You'd be able to create a nursing staffing model that would have allowed you to have specialization in priority program areas that would have been beneficial in terms of service level effectiveness. There was the opportunity potentially to really derive mutual benefit One of the communities had a public health specialist who was a real data guru. That was Oak Creek. South Milwaukee didn't have that. This person had extra capacity. The two could share that staff position. And then there were some specialized nurses in South Milwaukee who Oak Creek would have had benefit from sharing. So that was another plus. The potential to, by merging, to be able to fix the compensation structure to better compete for nursing staff. And just the fact that you'd have enhanced programmatic capacity due to economies of scale. So in our minds, those were reasons to seriously consider consolidation. But ultimately, Oak Creek said no. So why did they do so? First of all, to them, and this is not a critique, dollar savings are what mattered most. Public health services in a relatively affluent, growing community were just not as big a priority as economic development services and other key service areas. And there was some opposition within Oak Creek to the prospect of sharing a health department with a smaller neighbor. Given that, if there were no dollar savings, the perception was, why should we take on this political fight and move forward? Again, the potential to expand their public health services simply wasn't a high priority. There was also a shift in mayors during the course of the study, and the new mayor did not feel that doing this was as important as the previous mayor. What we heard from the public health officers was their inability with their small departments to recruit and retain public health nurses. And very frankly, and unfortunately, this was a concern that they had. That concern, that level of concern was not shared by elected leaders. And finally, this was, again, very legitimate. Environmental health, restaurant inspections, et cetera, was just a bigger priority for Oak Creek than sort of pure public health services. Therefore, and they didn't think that the merged department would address that as much as it would address some of the public health gaps. Overall, from elected officials' perspective, just no compelling reason to do it. We learned some lessons there, and we've brought these lessons to bear in our subsequent service sharing studies. First of all, you have to be clear about the objectives. And now again, when we come in to discuss service sharing studies with communities, we emphasize if dollar savings are the only driver, then maybe it's not worth it. You have to engage the subject matter experts and really have them be champions. So in the case of public health, the Board of Health, the health officer, the medical director, who could really credibly convey the importance, in this case, of enhanced public health programming. And during the course of the study, we simply didn't do that. And again, this is key to be just as clear about the consequences of not merging. That, hey, Oak Creek and South Milwaukee, if you don't merge, you're going to continue to have great difficulty recruiting and retaining nurses, as an example, to be just as clear about those consequences as you are about the benefits of merging. So finally, last slide, going forward, we think enhanced service sharing and consolidation continues to offer great promise to local governments across Wisconsin. We think it's an economic development issue. We think that being able to convince employers who you're trying to attract to your region is going to be easier if you can show that you have streamlined your services and that you're as efficient and effective as you can be. Municipal fiscal constraints, as Mark said, and county fiscal constraints, those were intensifying pre-pandemic. Things are changing now. And the federal dollars that are coming into many communities are really providing a life raft for a few years, but our assumption is that those strict constraints are going to return when those dollars are exhausted. We know the tight labor market is returning, and that's going to exacerbate recruitment and retention issues for governments. And that's especially the case in areas like EMS, when you really need highly skilled people, and in both fire and EMS, if you still want to rely on part-time people. Finally, capital budgets are really emerging as a foremost fiscal challenge for local governments for areas of service that are capital intensive, like fire, where a ladder truck costs $1 million. That's where you can really see some dollar savings. So I will conclude there. I'd be happy to answer some questions at the end. And again, Derek, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rob. Really interesting. I mean, it's just a hot topic right now, and obviously a lot of communities, it could be their major expense. So I know a lot of people are considering it, but you really put forward some good things to consider about that, and as you said, about the objectives and what you really want to get out of that. But I think ultimately, even if there is not a cost savings, just the fact that you said, it's going to be harder to recruit some of these workers is a major issue. And then also, if you model that form of consolidation and it's successful, how can you also model that in other ways, like you said, with other departments or other things like that. So hopefully those are considerations, but really appreciate that. And we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end for that. So thank you. Want to move to our next guest speaker here. And it's Tom Walsh. He's an economist for the Department of Workforce Development. Talks a lot about labor, but just in general, an economist. We've had him on here before and work with him on a regular basis. Really appreciate you being here today, Tom, and I'll let you get started. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I, again, just very briefly, not only a labor market economist, but a regional labor market economist, primarily covering southeastern Wisconsin. So hopefully having a little bit of an extra and more local perspective, even though as I say that, my next point will be that this presentation will be a little bit more broad level, just because I feel like that's the point in time where we're at right now, because there's a lot to cover. And so I'll try and do my best to very briefly just give some context and just give a little bit of I'll give a little bit of my insights on what we've seen and what we can expect going forward. So if you go to the next slide, I want one more. So through this pandemic and recently in what we're seeing is now the start of a more normal recovery, it's very difficult to have data to tell us where we're at. So one of the statistics that I've been following closely is claims for unemployment insurance. And what we saw early on in the pandemic was really unprecedented. What we're seeing now is a return to more you could call it normal claims levels, but still above where they were in 2019. If you go to the next slide, but as a little bit of context with that, and sorry, just very briefly, the county is really following the same path. So showing this point that that the county and the state are really similar in that and what we're looking at. The one that I seem to be missing here in my slide deck, I also had a comparison of what claims are looking like in 2000 and or what our current claims are looking at right now compared to what they were looking at in 2009. So 2009 being the Great Recession and being record claims volume. So what we're seeing now is that we actually have claims volume that is about half, a little less than half of what we had in 2009. So why do I bring up those 2 years? So really comparing a record high to a record low is I think a really good sense of where we're at right now. That we're in terms of labor market, we're not to the point where we were in 2019, but we're in a better place than we were coming out of or in the midst of a recession in 2009. And again, just highlighting that claims in Walworth County roughly followed what we were looking at in the state. So I think really that broader overall picture is a pretty good sense of where we're at right now. So going on to the next slide. So really the point I would usually make in a presentation like this is looking at where we are in terms of industry employment and trying to break down the data a little bit further and really identify some certain things that are more industry specific. Really, even though I have a table here, the data is too far behind to get a really good picture of where we're at right now. So I want to use this as more of an opportunity to take a look at some of these industries and it really highlight some more bigger points of what we have going forward here. So one in particular is this leisure and hospitalities industry. This one, as we all know, was incredibly hard hit. by the pandemic for really very obvious and very intuitive reasons, being that things were shut down, and by the nature of that, many people were out of work in this industry. This is one where I don't think it's a question of will it come back. I think it's more of a question of how it will come back and what kind of changes we're going to see within leisure and hospitality is based on some of the structural changes coming out of the pandemic. Big point here. I think that travel will be a little bit different in that I think people have more remote work options, and therefore there might be more of an opportunity and more of this tendency for people to go on shorter vacations where they bring their laptop with them and do a day of work from their Airbnb and then spend the rest of the weekend in the area. Along with that, this is an industry that I think is really going to see kind of a boom based on pent-up demand. I think there's so much there's so much desire to be out and about and be among people that I see that this industry being one that could be coming back. I think more for Walworth County, it's how do you put yourself in a position where people are spending their leisure and their leisure money within Walworth County. I think just one kind of stat to back that up. One poll I've seen was that 68% of people are planning on traveling this summer. That's a pretty big chunk of the population that's looking to be out and about and spending. Along with that, there is some increases in saving rates that could be seen in this industry. So the next industry I wanted to highlight was that education and health services industry. So this one was a little bit counterintuitive. When we're looking in the midst of the pandemic, this industry was down, and it was primarily coming from health services. That seems odd, given that we were in a public health crisis, but it does kind of make sense that since we had cut out any non-essential healthcare services, this was an area that the health services, it was an area that saw layoffs. Long term, that's not one that I'm worried about. I think the one that comes with further discussion is the education sector. So education has been obviously difficult, to say the least, over the last year and a half. But what are the changes and what are the innovations that came up with education are going to stick around? We don't know. And so we don't know exactly what's going to happen with staffing in that industry. So education actually later on in the pandemic saw somewhat of a hit, and it was largely more from the support occupations. So more from the tutors or the people that were providing food services within the physical buildings. How that comes back, I think, is a question for the future, and one I think to watch. Third industry I want to highlight on this slide is that construction industry. So construction is one of the few industries that actually increased. And I know this slide for Walworth County, there's a few others, but this is one where overall on a larger scale, construction is something that really bounced up during the pandemic. And I think that was kind of a surprise to a lot of people. And this is one where, based on the people I work with and the people I'm seeing, the employment in this area actually likely could have gone up even more had the construction companies been able to fill all the positions they wanted to fill. So again, just to really summarize this, I hate to throw a slide up and say that that the data is no good, but this one is one where it definitely has its value, but it's more limited based on the context of where we are right now, because everything's moving so quickly. So typically and historically, as an economist, I can use data that's maybe way behind by normal terms, but I can see a long-term trend that I can identify, and it's very usable and very valuable. Right now, we have a lot to watch, and I think it is going to be something, it's going to be key for the future to really kind of pay attention to how things are changing. And that's something I'll get into a little bit more later on in the presentation. But moving on to the next slide. So really the one of the biggest questions that either I get directly or I can just know people are trying to ask is, if we are looking at a time where we had a massive amounts of layoffs, why are companies still reporting struggles in terms of finding workers? So I have kind of a two-part answer. One part of the answer is, I think there is a lag time based on the uncertainty that we've just gone through. So what I've been saying up until about 3 months ago is that a normal economic recovery, or not, I shouldn't say normal, but a typical or an economic recovery that acted like an economic recovery wasn't going to start until we got through the public health crisis. Now we're at a point where we can start looking at the economic recovery more like a typical economic recovery because we've gotten through some of the uncertainty. That said, I think we are still in a point where there is some lag between people that were uncertain about re-entering the workforce and them actually going and moving into the workforce. So I think that when you get to that big question about, if we had so many layoffs, why are we still having trouble finding workers? So I think that's a small part. That is a part of it. So I say small, but not definitely not insignificant. Another part of it, or I should say, and also more temporary. Another part of it, and really the bigger point that I want to make, is highlighting a lot of these ongoing workforce challenges. So this slide is really kind of going back to slides I was using pre-pandemic. So going back and talking about longer term issues and things that we were seeing before this situation happened, and now I think we're at a point where they come back into the spotlight again. So the three that I always used to highlight were transportation, which Mark mentioned in his part, and I thought it was really interesting talking about the programs that Walworth County has and how much demand there is for that. And I see it being a huge positive that it's something that is on the radar as being addressed. Along with that, housing, and then finally, and then the third was always talent recruitment. So among those were three that I had always heard about. And really, no matter what the industry, no matter what the group of people, I would hear about these barriers to employment. I think the recruitment one is one where it's not necessarily finding someone, it's finding the right person. And so I think we have a combination of both finding enough bodies and just finding the right people to fill positions, which with job descriptions pretty consistently changing. So with those three, I don't really put it up with solutions as much as highlighting that these are barriers that need to be addressed. And then finally, the fourth one that was, I would say, on the radar, but really went from part of the discussion to being really in the forefront, really in the spotlight, is childcare. I think really we saw very good examples of this when schools being shut down, of how big of a deal childcare is, and really something that didn't get enough attention before this. But I put this on there now in my big four in terms of something that is really an ongoing challenge for the workforce of how do you fully utilize your workforce when there's childcare needs that aren't addressed. So I guess you could maybe call it a positive that we're going back to talking about the barriers and the challenges that were existing before. It does feel a little bit, it does feel kind of nice to almost go back and be not just talking pandemic, but then the other end of it is these are some pretty major barriers. And I really do, for a crowd like this, kind of put it out there as somewhat of a challenge in thinking about how do you work on helping to overcome these for a workforce, and how do you make this something that, how do you make it possible to fully utilize your available workforce? So going on to the next slide. So this one is really not a slide with much information on it. This is more of my placeholder for me to just kind of continue going off on a little bit of more of a tangent, which, to be totally honest, this presentation is a little more of bringing up questions than it is about bringing up answers, because I think it is really a point in time to more kind of set the stage for things to come. So with this slide, I'm calling it what will stick. And really what I mean by that is, of the things that we learned and of the strategies that were developed out of sheer necessity over the last year and a half, how much of that is going to become normal business practice? So how many of those things are going to basically stick around? So really with any of them, the common theme is technology and the way that we had to use technology over the last year and a half. My assessment of it is that if you had asked me a year and a half ago, I would have said that our technology was way ahead of our ability to use it, and that the processes within businesses and the processes we use to use technology were behind what we had available to us. I think we've done a total 180 on that, in that now I think our ability to use technology is ahead of some of the infrastructure and some of the technology we have. So one point being just the availability of the infrastructure is something to watch. So this is something that really you see on two levels. It's either what I call the last mile or the last foot. So in some areas, is there actually the physical infrastructure available to take advantage of technology? In that, can people, even if they have the money, if they want broadband internet, could they get it? The last foot being, if that broadband internet is available, do people have access to it, and how are they able to actually take advantage of the opportunities that it provides? So I think that's one big theme, one big point in what we need to watch going forward, in that of these business processes we develop, can we actually take advantage of them? Another point, maybe a little bit more positive, is things like how do we use it to be more efficient, and how do we use it to address some of the points that we need to overcome? So some of the things we need to overcome. So one of the points one of the areas I like to look at is healthcare. So healthcare is an area that was looking at shortages. It was looking at disparities in healthcare coverage. One of the things that had to be developed was things like remote consultations and covering more remote services, and that's something that I think really could be a big positive going forward. So I'm trying to kind of end it with that, in that I really do think that a lot of the things, that lessons learned out of this pandemic, are really going to have some very positive impacts for the workforce and for the economy, in that a lot of the strategies that were needed are also strategies that will be really needed and helpful for addressing some of the tight labor market concerns, and really better positioning us to use the available labor market in better ways. So that's really trying to be my silver lining on how can we take a objectively negative situation and really use it for the future to be better and come back stronger than ever. That said, because I'm an economist and I can't just end with a positive, I do have to say the thing to watch will be who gets left behind, and how and what changes, and make sure that we have a very close eye on that, and make sure we have a very close eye on making sure the people that end up not coming back are either retrained or utilized in a way that they're not left behind, and they can also take advantage of some of the positives that I think we see coming out of here. So that was really a shotgun approach at a presentation. Typically, I think the recommendation would be to be laser focused. I think we're with an atypical point in history. I think I went more like a shotgun and hit on a million different topics. But that said, I think hopefully there was some insights there, and hopefully there was some food for thought that really kind of gets this group thinking about about what kind of changes we're going to see and how we can take what we learned and really bring it in and really bring it and really move it forward in a way that makes Walworth County better and puts it in a stronger position. And so now, now I can turn it over, I think, to the rest of the group for questions. And I'd be happy to answer questions now, or my contact information is here for anyone that wants to hit me up individually.
All right, great. Tom, really appreciate that. And I think you did raise some good questions there, particularly everybody's worried about workforce and, just talking about those 4 different factors with transportation, childcare, recruitment efforts, finding the right person and housing. And, those are things that were echoed by our other speakers here too, in some regards. And I think it's...
I'll say this is a really hard one to prepare for, because usually I don't like to put information on a slide and say it's not really that good. But right now it's more kind of the sense of where we are and kind of just stay tuned. At some point we're gonna end up having better data. We'll be able to dig a little deeper into these topics. But for now, I think it's a point of just raising up the bigger point and
yeah, no, absolutely. I think it made sense, and so really appreciate that. That'll be some good things for different discussions. But I think what I'll do, because I know Mark Luberda has a hard stop at 9, so maybe what I'll do is try to open up questions for Mark first, and then we'll open it up generally to the other 2 speakers. But if anybody wants to, if they have a question, if you're able to just unmute, you can ask your question at this time, or I'll look at the chat function too, but if it might be easier just to unmute and ask your question now if you have one for Mark Luberda. Mark, you were so comprehensive that they didn't have any question. I guess one thing I was thinking, Mark, was, about this federal funding, which I think, is exciting in a lot of ways, but I know it's going to be challenging, like you said, because it sounds like a lot of money, but when you spread it throughout the county and across the number of different key major areas, it probably isn't a lot. But I know you'll be talking to the WASITA board, and you've mentioned, some other community groups that you've been. What are your plans for that? Like, are you going to be hosting any kind of open public forums, or encouraging people to come to your board meetings to do that? Or if you could just mention that.
We will have, I'm sure, a number of committee and board meetings where it becomes a primary topic. I know I'll also be engaging the ICC, which is the group that has all the mayors and village presidents. I plan to coordinate with the other administrators, because there may be some ways we can leverage some benefit. I'll give you one idea. It's sort of letting the cat out of the bag a little early, but we've been working for a couple years here on a radio system upgrade countywide that will support all police and fire, and we're building that backbone, which is going to be, probably a $22 million project that will take 4 years to put in place. We've just about got an RFP that's going to go on the street. Part of that project, from the early conception before I got here, will require the local communities to pay for new replacement radios, which spread among the communities could be, as much as $3 million, $3.5 million that they have to try and do. One of the ideas on my list, if we don't, have greater priorities, might be maybe we could help provide, if the rules don't allow us to directly help support by these 4 communities, maybe we could help them look at some of their sewer and water needs, which we're allowed to spend money on, use them as a sub-agency and give them equivalent amounts or some share of the amounts that they can use towards sewer and water to then free up money to buy their radios. So my county board hasn't even heard that yet. It's just an example of one of the ideas on the list. We're trying to get as many ideas as we can. You know, I'd love to have $50 million worth of ideas so that we can pick the best 20 million. And so we're going to try to get the word out there and talk to as many people as possible. I'm contemplating trying to get an article in some of the papers where we say, hey, you know, if here's what the general categories are. If you know, members of the citizenry reading this have ideas, email them to us, because we can't debate an idea we don't have. So my goal in this next month is to continue to drag out as many ideas as we can.
That's great. Okay, good. I do see there was one question here regarding probably your territory, Tom. And you know, you're hearing this, and obviously it's been a factor, but in terms of the unemployment extra benefits and how that's been impacting, you know, workers just not looking for jobs, kind of staying home, collecting that extra unemployment insurance. And we're hearing different states that are, you know, kind of ending that, but Wisconsin not. But could you address that topic, Tom?
Yeah, and I'll try to kind of really briefly. So I guess very high level terms, if you're looking at people aren't searching for a job, they're less likely to be employed or find a job. I think so. So that said, you do have that point that if there are some requirements, there are certain things that would make it harder to get people back to work. I think one of the difficult things about this, and one of the hard truth is, I think that it's a little bit of a scapegoat to think that it's just the federal guidelines or just a different state policy that is making it difficult to find workers. So I guess I don't want to dismiss it, or I don't want to downplay the concerns on that. But what I do want to do is make sure to highlight that I think the bigger picture are the things that are more longer term and more of the issues with a tight labor market. So I kind of just stress that I don't think changes in these types of policy are going to be the silver bullet that all of a sudden makes labor really easy to find. So I hope that's kind of a good way of putting it, that I think we're looking at people coming back to the workforce that were hesitant and uncertain about doing so, or that they really wanted to come back to the workforce, but for example, their kids weren't guaranteed to be in school or in person, so they kind of have that issue of, how do I go take a new job when I also have to say I need 2 weeks off now for my child. I just want to kind of keep the focus more on the longer term tight labor market issues that we were seeing before this, and we're going to see going forward.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Tom. Rob, you looked like you wanted to say something. I don't know if you did or not, but otherwise I have another question that came in.
I actually was just going to say something with regard to the question you asked Mark. You know, the forum has a long history of being sort of a watchdog of sorts over government finance. And, you know, I can tell you in my 25 years of being close to or working in local government in Wisconsin, I've never seen a scenario where suddenly the question isn't where are we going to cut this year, but it's how are we going to spend a lot of money that we currently have. And, you know, when I listen to Mark talk about ideas, I mean, exactly the types of things that he is talking about are the types of things that, you know, we would politely suggest are appropriate. The last thing you want to see local governments do is plug these dollars into operating budgets or create programs that are going to need to be sustained after the dollars run out if they can't otherwise afford them. Conversely, where you would like to see them spending these dollars is on pressing capital needs. You know, if they can do this to avoid having to issue debt, that's going to help them not only to get a project done quickly, but, you know, going out 15 years if they typically issue 15-year debt. And, you know, responding directly to issues that have emerged as a result of the pandemic that maybe hopefully will dissipate after the pandemic. So those are the types of uses for these federal dollars that are optimal, and there are obviously exceptions, but just more food for thought as we think about this very nice challenge.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Another question came in, and it looks like, Tom, they're just wanting you to see if you could comment on this relating to childcare. And the question had mentioned that, they're talking with somebody, a colleague who lives in Lake Geneva, who cannot find childcare and was told that a third of the daycares in Wisconsin closed due to the pandemic, and also that the wages for daycare workers top out at about $12.50, and so I guess just potentially a big issue here. But just curious what you or any of the speakers might comment on that.
Yeah, and I can try and comment while also saying I'm not going to have a great answer. Just in that, I think like I know one of the points one of the stories I always think of when I used to work for Milwaukee Area Tech, our early childhood education program was like in front of the board, and they were like sounded like they were arguing with the board, but they were both agreeing that childcare workers aren't paid enough. So it's one of the most bizarre things I've been a part of. But so I always think of that. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's just from one standpoint. Trying to get people into that field is a struggle. So it's really a high need, but the wages don't necessarily support getting people in there. But that brings up other topics, because then it's just like, if wages increase, where does affordability go? So I not a childcare expert, but I think there is that it's a really tricky topic, because on one level you want to get more people into the field, and a way to do that is by increasing wages. On the other end, but on the same end of that, it's already difficult for families to afford. So finding that balancing act of how do you get people to the field while also keeping it affordable, I think is really the question that, if I had an answer to, I really would absolutely love to share it. But I think it's hopefully kind of going to be something that can improve on in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Well, good.
Derek, I can add to that. I'd like to thank Diane for her question, because what I saw was another idea for my list.
Oh, okay, good.
Is there something we should be doing in that? That's, and they're all small businesses. It's a business that supports other businesses, essentially, by making it often making it possible for people to be, enter the workforce and be part of the workforce. So it's definitely something I think we need to talk about. Is there something we can do there to help get through this sort of economic restart period? We have funding through 2024. After that, I wouldn't be able to have our money address it, but it's probably a question you'll see me asking with CETA board at the meeting next week.
Good.
And Derek, if I could just add, so this is one of those under the radar issues that's being debated right now as part of the next state budget. That's just critical. And the news yesterday that the state now looks like it has more revenue to spend. I think in terms of an economic development issue, unfortunately, childcare is not often thought of as an economic development issue, but it certainly is. So I know the governor's proposed budget did have a big additional investment in childcare, including increasing or establishing a monthly base payment to certain providers, bonus payments for providers who are caring for infants and toddlers, stipends for the highest quality childcare centers. And so I'm not here to advocate for those proposals, but this is a key state budget issue. And so I think the question was very relevant.
Good. No, I'm glad. Thanks for bringing that to everyone's attention too, Rob. Appreciate that. Well, I know we're wrapping up here. I don't know, does anybody have any other questions here? I know we're going to provide we'll send this video out to everybody who participated. We'll have that available for others if they missed it, or somebody heard about it, wants to see it. We'll have the contact information from the speakers. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with anybody offline. Just again, appreciate everyone's support of WCETA and this event. Look forward to seeing you in person going forward. I guess the one last piece I would say, because workforce is just such a pressing issue, is that, and this isn't necessarily a pitch, but I think whatever you can do to help advance and upskill your workforce, I think can pay off significantly. And we have a tremendous resource here, a few resources really, but Gateway Technical College, and we partner with them on some things, fundamentals of supervision and that, but they have a lot of other offerings that are very reasonably priced that can really help dramatically. And then we have UW Whitewater there as well. So, I would just urge people to take advantage of that. You can always contact me and I can get you in touch with the right people. But I think going forward, it's going to be critical to maximize the human capital that you do have and leverage that as much as you can. So with that, again, thank you to our speakers. Really appreciate that and look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thank you.